All right, are we ready? Sorry, we've been doing hybrid and we did try to prepare in advance today.
All right. All systems go.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone to our panel discussion about equitable school funding in both Pennsylvania and at home in Philadelphia. My name is Samantha Connors. I'm one of the co-directors here at Da Vinci Art Alliance, which is, if you didn't already know, a 91-year-old organization committed to building community through art. We do that in a lot of different ways, one of which is our fellowship shows and fellowship programs, which Mike Smaczylo, did I get it?
Yes.
Thank you. So this is the first time. Mike Smaczylo is one of our 2022 fellowship artists. We're in one his exhibition right now, which is all about the progressive era of education in Philadelphia, and 100 years later, what the neighborhoods look around them. Mike will give much more information than the basic thing I just said. And we're joined today on our panel with Stephanie King next to me and Dan Urevick-Ackelsberg. But want to open the floor for all three of you to talk more about yourselves and what we're going to be talking about today in terms of school funding.
Cool.
I'm gonna start with Stephanie. What? Oh, I have a whole lead-in.
Okay, so my name is Stephanie King. I am the parent of a 7th grader and a 3rd grader at Kearney Elementary School in Northern Liberties. I got involved in school activism because Northern Liberties has very segregated public schools. Even though Northern Liberties, depending on how you draw the border, is between 55 and 70% white, I am the parent of 50% of the white students in the entire school. And so what that means is that funding does follow enrollment in the Philadelphia school district. And a lot of the funding for what is extra comes from parent involvement and parent fundraising. So that is a situation that the haves and the have-nots is an incredibly, Dan is going to talk about statewide, but even when you receive equal funding on paper, it looks a lot different in real life.
So I live in South Philadelphia. I have two kids. I have a son in 1st grade who goes to Southwark at 9th and Mifflin. I am an attorney at an organization called the Public Interest Law Center. We're a civil rights nonprofit in Center City. And in that capacity, we do we've historically done a lot of work around education. Well before my time, filed a lawsuit related to the education of children with disabilities that led to a law, was one of the precursors that led to the law known as IDEA. And sort of from that work, sort of looking out for the rights of kids with disabilities into the the 80s and 90s, it became clear that really schools just generally were underfunded, particularly for economically disadvantaged kids, for kids learning English. My office filed a lawsuit in the 1990s along with the city of Philadelphia against the state of Pennsylvania for how they funded public schools, and lost. Wasn't ever actually able to get to trial. That the Supreme Court at the time said that, I'm talking very fast, said that you can't bring that kind of lawsuit in Pennsylvania. In 2014, amid a period of, for those who are public school parents or who remember this time, really devastating school funding cuts that had come from the Corbett administration, we tried again. And so in 2014, on behalf of 6 school districts, not Scotia to Philadelphia, some parents and a couple of statewide organizations, we brought another lawsuit against the state for how it funds public schools. And that's really what I've spent the last number of years of my career doing. Trial just ended a few months ago. And so that's sort of I talk a lot about school funding, and I'm happy to sort of talk about sort of the conditions by which led to the lawsuit, but that's sort of my contribution, is trying to sue the state to actually fund our public schools.
I'm Mike Smaczylo. I am a artist, I guess, and public high school teacher in Philadelphia. I teach at Kensington Health Sciences Academy. It's a small neighborhood, but also CPE school, so kind of a complicated catchment situation. But should I talk about the project? Or
Yeah.
Okay. So where we're sitting in this exhibition is kind of like a process that started while I was in grad school with my thesis, which was the idea is basically like I always loved the architecture of Philadelphia public schools. I would drive around it and be so sick. I attended one for a couple of years in my schooling career. And I think I just wanted to do a project that centered around them, but the more research I did, the more I found out that they were not what I saw them as. I saw them as these really cool things, and they were built as this really amazing investment in public education during the Progressive era, and then 100 years passed of disinvestment in communities and disinvestment in the public education system, and they become kind of these like tombs or these empty shells of this like ideal that they were built behind. So I made this project to kind of encapsulate like how the neighborhoods have changed to serve these diverse communities, while the schools have remained and become these kind of monolithic structures that kind of tower over these neighborhoods as like a testament to this kind of like forgotten, idealized era of public education in both Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the country as a whole.
Thank you, everyone. So I wanted to talk more with you, Mike, about how all of these monolithic structures are representative of 100 years ago. We had this like wealth of funding, right? That was really invested in public services and specifically public education. And over the last 100 years, it's like flipped on its head, that that's essentially the thing that is least funded now in Philly. And do you, as an educator, see a way that we can move forward to bring those schools back into a new progressive era? Or do you think we have to move away from it and invest in like different things?
Good question. So in terms of like where all this started, this idea of like progressive era of education, like there was this movement during, the progressive era for most things is considered like up until World War II, starting in the late 1890s and so. But like in education, it went all the way up until almost World War II, where for years and years, there was massive investment of public funding into education and just social programs in general to try and kind of like end this really awful like industrial revolution era of like just really like they wanted to turn our cities into like these utopias and this like metropolitan vision of like success and have a really amazing populations of like educated and qualified workers and people. So like they in that time period built 140 schools, over 140 schools in Philadelphia, and this happened in other cities too. From Atlanta to Boston to all the school districts. Just huge amount of money spent to invest in public education. There was this amazing thing called the Gary Plan that started in Gary, Indiana, where they would build buildings like the ones that are pictured here. And the idea wasn't that they would just be a school. The library would be a public library that would serve the whole neighborhood. They would have night classes for either like low income or like immigrant populations to try and like benefit them and get them like higher paying jobs and like give them new qualifications and things like that. And then all of a sudden the Great Depression happens and all of that funding is cut. They just decide like, well, we tried this Gary Plan, it worked some places and built some really amazing populations of people and built some amazing communities. And then they just slashed it off because there was no money, because the fake money, the stock market, which again doesn't exist, like just collapses. And for some reason, all of these people in these communities are like kind of like put out on their what's from these amazing programs. And when that happens, another like 80 years passes now of a continued lack of funding and a continued lack of investment and a continued lack of imagination to try and get our cities to where they like should be and where they originally like what was intended when these schools were built. And in terms of your second part of your question, like whether or not I see it as like the future, it's tough because I'm someone who loves like adaptive reuse and someone who like loves using old buildings. All the buildings featured here are in the National Register of Historic Places. Most of them were added in the late 80s. So like with that, like, and again, I love the way these buildings look, like especially from the outside, because the inside aren't so pretty. But I think like a part of me is like, is there a way that we are able to revitalize these? Are they worth revitalizing? Many of them will cost less than building a new school. But at the same time, like part of me is like when they sold West Philly High School to, you know, give it to a developer and turn it into lofts that, you know, could further populate, you know, West Philly and continue to gentrify it. Like when they did that, they built this kind of like a new school for West Philadelphia, but it's kind of like a Cracker Jack box little school they put together and only built to serve a number of students because the rest of the students already live at Garfield in West Philly, don't have any public schools left in West Philly. So I don't know, it's a hard question in terms of what should happen with these buildings, what should happen with these schools, and also like who decides, because at the end of the day, the public should be deciding the fate of these buildings, not, you know, just the school board, not just the people in charge, and not just developers, because as of now, like developers, quote unquote developers, have too big of a say, and real estate has too big of an impact on like what we decide happens to public schools. Cool.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm like.
Yes,
processing.
that was a lot. It's a long question.
Yeah. It was making me think a lot about what we were talking about the other day about the public obligation to public schools too, of like. I feel like everything with your exhibition has had my brain spinning a lot because I don't have kids and I only know information about schools from either my friends who are parents or teachers. And when Stephanie and I were talking the other day, Stephanie said this really, in my opinion, good phrase of public obligation to public schools of like, it really should be a community effort of like what our schools look like and what our neighborhoods are investing into those spaces, because the school, I mean, you can talk more about this, but like, I think that there's a lot of like misinformation or like not even misinformation, but like people just don't know about what's happening. And even like what we were talking about the other day, which I would like you to tell other people about with what's happening at your school and some of the issues around like leveling and just like disinvestment based on like parent participation, based on like personal needs of families.
Well, I think it goes back to what Mike was talking about, right? That like, we used to build things and we used to believe in investing in public education because it was a public good and people had, you know, kind of this obligation where, you know, you supported the building and the maintenance and the support of these schools because you sent your kids there or your neighbor sent their kids there and, you know, you felt that it was this communal thing that we were all participating in. My school was built during the same era, you know, this is the 100th anniversary of the building of our school, and it's really lovely and has fallen into disrepair, and that's just like a big metaphor for the public school system in Philadelphia in general. But we have completely lost sight of that with this sort of like austerity budgeting mindset. We tell, you know, the city tells parents that it's not, you know, school building is not an anchor of a community that you're all going to send your children to. They tell them that education is crabs in a barrel, that we're all going to climb over each other to get whatever advantage we can for our own children. And in the process, throw our neighbors' children under the bus to get them into, you know, a better building, you know, more teachers, more funding, more whatever. So I have great admiration for the school funding lawsuit. And I'm rooting for them so hard, but theoretically right now, Philadelphia School District is one district and everybody's equally funded, and that's just not the case at all. And you see that in which schools have libraries, in which schools have new playgrounds, in which schools are on donors choose fundraising for robotics labs instead of fundraising for books and papers and pencils like my school is.
Yeah.
So even if Dan wins, I mean, when Dan wins, like that's not going to be enough to fix it entirely.
Yeah, and that was the question I had for you too, Dan, was like, in terms of the idea of what equitable funding looks like I know your case is for the statewide. But like, what does that look like in a city like Philadelphia, where there are newer schools that have been built that don't necessarily need the same amount of funding as a school that still has asbestos, or like hasn't been able to fund programs and like just don't have art or music or a language that like another school down the street does have access to?
So there's, I mean, for a lot of historical reasons, we treated capital funding as sort of this own sort of separate issue. I mean, at the highest level, what an idealized version of a school funding lawsuit win looks like, or what an idealized version of a school funding system looks like, is when a kid comes into school, presents with a need, you meet the need. It's like, it's so simple. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, we started off the case, one of our first witnesses was a superintendent of the Greater Johnstown School District. And for those who aren't familiar, Greater Johnstown is an old steel city, small city in Western Pennsylvania in Cambria County that lost, I think, about 2/3 of its population from its peak. Extraordinarily impoverished population. And the superintendent talked about, like in Philadelphia, they do these assessments, internal assessments each year when the students come in to see how they're doing. They track to see how they're growing. And, you know, they're not the multiple day standardized state assessments, but they're these internal trackers to see where kids are, in theory, to tailor instruction to them. And what she sees is that 2/3 of her kindergartners, or maybe larger, need some measure of intervention. They qualify, they're behind where they should be. You know, the kindergartners can't identify the alphabet, things like that. But like, what she actually does with that information is not actually give the kids the instruction needs, because she can't afford to. So she gives some small, she picks each year who's going to actually get the attention of the reading specialist, and they just don't get it. So what, on a statewide level, and what a school funding system looks like, is you meet the need. It also means that each child should have you know, safe, modern facilities, whether they're in old buildings or old structures or new, that don't have asbestos, that can handle the electrical circuits, that electrical needs of the 21st century, and can have Wi-Fi that goes through the walls. And you know, for things like art and music and language, I mean, I think that one of the things we really try to make clear in the lawsuit is a lot of, like, by their nature, a lot of these lawsuits are based a lot on statistics. How are the kids actually doing by any number of measures, not just by keystones and PSSAs or standardized tests, but how many are graduating from high school, how many are getting into college, things like that. But that kids are obviously not simply the sum of what they get on a standardized test, and you also need to treat, you need to give kids things that you can't measure. I mean, there's a lot of intangible things that you need to give to kids. And you know, what is a school funding lawsuit? A school funding lawsuit looks like you give kids what they need, what every parent wants for their own kids, and if you walk into a well-funded suburban high school, what they would be getting. I mean, it's so easy to know, because you could find 10 school districts within a 20-minute drive of Philadelphia that have what a school funding system should look like. They just don't have the same level of student need, despite having extra resources. That's a rambling answer.
And how have you two experienced that, like, as a teacher and then as a parent?
You wanna go first?
Good.
So, I mean, for me, it's a lot of it for me is tough, because I am fortunate to teach in a building with air conditioning, and fortunate to teach. And also, it's interesting because I see being the only art teacher in my school as a positive sometimes, because I get our whole art budget and I'll have to split it with the music teacher. And if I did have to split it with the music teacher, it would be extremely thin. I already warn my kids, I make a lot of like kind of diffusing jokes of like, please don't throw my erasers, they're the only erasers I have for the year. And that helps them take seriously that they shouldn't throw the erasers across the room. But I have a lot of colleagues, people who I went to grad school with, and people I know from education, who's like art programs and programs in general are just incredibly underfunded. And I just remember when I was working at the office, I worked as a graduate assistant at our education department at college. We'd always be like, oh, someone donated this box of paint, and there'd be like 10 art teachers clamoring just for a box of paint, you know. Or if you belong to, there's a Philadelphia art teachers group on Facebook and, someone will post it and they're like, hey, I found this extra, a couple pads of paper. And like literally 6 teachers are like, can I get this? Oh, I'll do that for them if they don't pick it up and stuff like that. And like, I needed new posters for my room because I was like a relatively new teacher. I needed decorations and I was lucky to be the first person to comment on something because 25 people commented after me trying to get these posters because it's just like there's barely money in the arts budget for paint, the cheapest paint, let alone like money in the budget for buying really nice posters of different art and things like that. So it's like as a teacher, I've experienced that side of it, but also the side of it that you mentioned like the special education side of it. Like my school's lucky we didn't get levels this year, but there are special education teachers in Philadelphia who are getting moved to different schools who now won't be able to serve the special education populations of those schools. And the same thing goes for English language learners. It's kind of like a crapshoot and depends on like whether or not one kid goes on vacation for the first couple of weeks of the school year, or whether or not your teachers get leveled and your kids end up without anything from like a special education teacher to an English teacher, So seeing that happen around the place, my principal emailing us every single day with updates about attendance, trying to figure out whether we're going to lose one of our valued teachers was really intense. And it shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be real. It's not something that anyone should have to deal with.
Can I put in really quick? I didn't know what level
Yes,
it
Miss
was
Pannepacker.
until a week ago, so, for the audience, I think both of you probably.
Yeah.
Could you expand on what leveling is? 'Cause
Sure.
I feel like it's also like a very Philly specific thing that I never
Well, That's
experienced that growing up.
that's because they don't do it other places and nobody else would stand for that to happen to their children in other places. So what leveling is, or whatever, what are they calling it now? Resource driven enrollment. Right, they can give it some new fake name, is if they didn't cut enough teachers from you during the budget process in the off season, they recheck the enrollment after, towards the end of September, once things have sort of shaken out, however they're gonna shake out. And if they discover that one school is a little short, they're like, whoops, we need another teacher over here. They don't go out and hire another teacher. What they do is they look at all of the other schools that have too few students, like, oh no, somebody got a small class size this year. And they level that teacher, which is to say they take that teacher away from the other school and force transfer them to a new school. And this saves the school district $12 million a year out of their $3.5 billion budget, of which they spend about, like $12 million on consultants for pretty much every board of education meeting. So what this means is your kid goes to school for 6 weeks. They got their teacher, they got their classes, everything's going cool. And then the school district comes in and says, whoops, you don't get a teacher anymore. That teacher gets forced transferred, your class gets collapsed into whatever, now it's got however many 34 kids, whatever the max limit is, which of course, if more kids come later in the year, they don't come back and give you that teacher back. Now you've just got 38 kids. If that creates a hole, you only have one art teacher or a special ed teacher or whatever it is. If your teacher gets cut and that was the only teacher, then everybody else in the school has to move around to a different grade 6 weeks in the school year and start teaching that other grade from scratch. So it completely blows up the classroom the teacher got leveled from. And it frequently throws the entire school into chaos because now you've just blown a huge hole in their teacher roster. So multiply that times however many schools by however many years, and you just got, and again, it disproportionately affects disadvantaged schools because they don't have mouthy middle-class white parents to go to the Board of Education and fight about it. So multiply that times however many years and however many kids, and those kids have wasted the first 6 weeks of the school year every single year. My school got leveled 4 years in a row. So, and then this year, we were waiting to find out if we're going to be able to keep our kindergarten teacher. If we lose our kindergarten teacher, then everybody's going to have to move around and my kid will lose her math teacher.
Tuesday is when that happens.
Tuesday is when it happens. Tuesday is when it happens. Thursday is when they find out where they're going to go. And again, you could have a teacher, you could have a principal who's like great at recruiting, like, oh my God, let's go, we're ready, like, we're ready to grow this year. Your principal gets in these like new teachers who are super hyped to join your community and fill in your holes in math or art or whatever, and then whoop, nope, they're gone.
I saw the pain on my principal's face because she spent the entire summer before the summer building like a dream team. Like she really felt that way about our team and was so worried that it was gonna be a level. She's just like, I put this together, and every year she's felt that way. Like I put this thing together and then it could all get taken away. And the community that we built, that we've spent weeks fostering, gets taken away. And one of the main things that drives student success is like continuity. Teachers coming back year after year, not getting moved. And the district knows that it disproportionately affects certain students, and that it's something that makes the schools worse over time, is when there's no continuity. They know that, they know it's a real problem, and they continue to do leveling despite that. They know that it affects the things they care about, like test scores. They know that it negatively affects that, but they still continue to do it because it saves them money so that they could refurbish their offices or hire consultants that are their friends.
So they did stop leveling during the last 2 years. They used some of that supplemental funding from the federal government not to do it because they knew it's terrible and that they should not do it during a pandemic. But maybe you notice that we actually are still in a pandemic. In addition to the fact that it does all of this stuff that, we're talking about, it creates a situation where we are always staffing schools as thinly as we can get away with, right? And so what that meant last year, whenever there was like a COVID outbreak, is that my kid had multiple times last year where there were literally not enough adults in the building to keep the school running safely, right? Because a third of the teachers were out with Omicron or whatever. They just didn't have, enough teachers. There were multiple times where her class was combined and sent to the gym. Because that's it, that's all they could do. The kids were there, they had to do something with them. And that, it goes back to that idea of public investment, right? Like, you can't run things on a shoestring forever. Like, you just cannot do that. Just like you can't, run something at 110% without it blowing out. We can't run our schools on a shoestring forever. And that's what the Philadelphia school districts has been doing. In some of these schools, like Penn Alexander has a Daddy Warbucks to give them extra bucks and buy them an extra kindergarten teacher every year and buy them support staff and all this other stuff. So they don't have to worry about it. But schools like the ones our kids, he teaches at or that our kids go to, that, that's the reality. The buildings are falling apart and they're not giving us enough people to work with.
Well, I think that's a good point too, of like, I know you're very passionate about this, so you can totally take over from what I'm about to say. But the magnet schools in Philly also, which I just saw Mike eye roll, so he is passionate about it.
That's right, let's warm up the magnet schools.
You think I'm passionate about it?
But then also something I learned this year working with Mike, that within the public school system, there is also magnet schools that anyone from all over the city can send their kids to, and it's more competitive. But they also have endowments and a lot more money and a lot more resources. And I think that goes into like the inequity conversation as well, of like which schools actually are able to provide these additional resources, because like there's more involvement of parents and more involvement of the community around them. And also like politically, there's more involvement. Go.
Is there a question?
Oh, I guess like
And more political involvement, question mark?
I just, I don't even know where to start. Like, there's just, you want to explain how it works since you're a parent?
I'm the explainer.
Yeah.
All right. So, the school, both at basically at fifth grade and at high school, students have the opportunity to apply to, what are they calling them now? Not selective admits anymore. There's always a new name for things, but they're magnet schools, whatever they're calling them now, they're magnet schools. You know, the big ones like Masterman and Central, but there are other smaller ones as well, where your child can apply, and it's a combination of grades and attendance, and is it a touchdown?
I gotta keep
All right.
my wrist keep going.
It's a combination of grades and, good attendance and staying out of trouble and having good PSSA scores, having good standardized test scores. And through that, they can get into a school that is better than, their default neighborhood high school. And what this means is that there are a whole lot of parents that are, number one, using private schools until they get to one of those admission points.
Sure.
Number two, a lot of parents who are committed to their neighborhood public school only until 5th grade. Number three, there is a heavy any one of those things, right? Is a place where, economic disadvantage can come to play. If your mom's pulling an overnight at CBS, maybe she doesn't get you to school on time, 95% of the time, boom, you're disqualified. Right? So we have created these schools where their demographics are not representative of the city of Philadelphia. They have much higher white populations. The school district of Philadelphia is only about 15% white. So go ahead and look up the demographics at any magnet school to see what that is. They are significantly less socioeconomically disadvantaged. And they raise enormous amounts of money. Central has an endowment that's in the millions of dollars. Masterman raises between $200,000 and $250,000 a year. To put that in perspective, I raise $3,000 a year, $1,500 of it that I spend on a pallet of cotton paper. So, with this kind of extra funding, they are able to afford things, like after school programs, like sports, like orchestra, etc. They also have, continuous full enrollment so that they're not affected by things like leveling, things that are enrollment driven. They're always going to have enough art and music teachers because they have enough leftover staff budget to buy those things. Well, the rest of it, like every year I go and I testify that my school doesn't have a music teacher. B, the kids have to put their names in a hat for a violin. And every year Superintendent Pike would send the guy over to me to tell me that in fact I was wrong. It was my principal's fault because at any point she is allowed to choose to use her budget on those things. And if that's true, she is, but my principal chooses to spend it on special education and extra, classroom teachers because that's what our school needs. And she's not, it's like saying, okay, well, that's her choice, is like saying, which limb am I going to cut off to get out of this bear trap? Right? Magnet schools don't have to make that choice. And when you see elected officials from city council or our state representatives talk about how they're proud public school parents, I encourage you to ask them where, because it's almost always one of the big magnet schools, right? They're not sending their kids to Ben Franklin. They're not sending their kids to Penn Treaty. They're sending their kids to Masterman and Central and then patting themselves on the back for how hard they support public school.
One thing I want to mention with that is I've talked to parents about this a lot, and I have public school teacher friends whose kids go to magnet schools, and some of them it's well, I've seen neighborhood schools, and I'm like, okay, well, you stop. But there's other people who they just want to send their kids to a good school. These are two parents right here who send their kids to public schools, and they just want to send their kids to a good school. So the parents of magnet school students will say that I just think that my kid deserves the best shot. And the thing that we're saying is there's nothing wrong with that, and you should want to send your kids to the best school. Our thing is that every single school should be the best school. And if the funding made sense, and if we were able to correct the inequities, we wouldn't have what I consider legalized school segregation in Philadelphia. There are a lot of people, because they tried to change the school selection process to get more diversity at Central and National and things like that. And the white parents flipped out. They went absolutely crazy. They were harassing us on Twitter, because they just don't want their kids to go to school with too many black kids. And for them, they want their kids to go to school with the right black kids, the ones who get into Central and get into National. It's legalized school segregation. And again, we should all be able to send kids to the best school possible. Every single school should be the best school possible. And like you mentioned, like in an idealized school funding situation, they all would have the resources, and they all would have what they need.
I played devil's advocate for a second, even though I'm a graduate of Central High School. The problem with magnet, not the problem with magnet schools, the magnet school on a funding level, I think that one of the things that happens is we talk about magnet schools, we're really actually just talking about like 3 schools in the entire city. And I think sometimes we get a little bit of a warped sense of like how much that's the reality for the vast majority of schools. So Central has a library because the Central alumni could build a library. It's the only school that can happen. Even like Masterman, which has a much more upper middle class student body than like a typical Philadelphia school, or SLA, pick your few other schools. Like I think that part of this is distorted literally just by the reality of Central. Masterman and Central and Masterman, even the entire school selection brouhaha that happened, basically that was really focused. It was the school district really trying to figure out, like in the last 10 years at Central, the number of Black kids at Central crashed, particularly Black men, Black boys crashed. And I think they couldn't, this is Mike, like I'm actually going to inside information, but I think they couldn't figure out like how we're going to go after just Central, how we're going to try to fix it in Central without making it a bigger thing to make it look like we're not targeting Central or whatever. And so I just think in general, a little bit, we get because it's, it's the school, a lot of people send their kids there, whatever, but it is, and a district of 130,000 district kids and 200,000 kids overall is 2,000 kids. And it's a little bit unique. And I think a lot of the magnet schools are really not, they don't have it's a whole different world. You go to like Carver or Bodine, like it is a very different student population. And part of why there was so much pushback, I think, citywide to the school selection process is you're targeting schools that really don't have diversity problems at their schools. Like they're so that's one. The second thing is just, by definition, a magnet school is going to have less student need than a neighborhood school. If you're taking the kids who have the easiest time in school. You're taking kids that have, are going to look at the number of kids that are classified as English language learners, as special education students. And so you're creating a system where those schools just don't have the level of student need that a neighborhood school comes from. Anyway, it's all just to say that, like, I think that we talk about the impact of magnet schools on the system. I think in some ways it can feel distorting because the most well-known high school is that school. And it's not like, I don't think most of the other magnet schools have the same level of resources that Central has. I don't think it's really anywhere particularly close.
I would say I agree with that. I think I just worry that for schools like Masterman, especially, and even schools like down the street, Columbo, like it's creeping in that direction of those schools having massive amounts of like, as our the public schools get quote unquote worse because of things like the pandemic. Whether you believe in like learning loss or not, like test scores aren't where they were, and they're not trending in the direction that the state especially wants them to be. And like, as you get into that, and as those neighborhood schools develop even like worse reputations, like, are we going to start developing more issues of a massive gap between like a school like Columbo, which historically I agree they have a more diverse population, more representative of the neighborhood, but is Columbo like the next Masterman, and is Masterman the next Central? And do we keep rolling down that hill because we keep feeding into this system that generates this discrepancy?
And also, I mean, so forgetting student population in Columbo had their entire roof collapse.
Yeah.
And there's flooding because like they don't have enough maintenance staff at Columbo. So even the quote unquote good schools like still don't have the basic. Again, Central has its library. It's like a fancy library in this building, a performing arts center or something like that. Like it is its own thing, but still, and like my neighborhood school is sort of, it's an underfunded school, and a lot of kids learning English, a lot of classified as economically disadvantaged. It also has a lot of advantages because it has squeaky wheel parents like me, who are able to like make the system work for their kids by yelling enough. But it's, you know, so I think about that school and it's still, it's a progressive era school. Like I've been inside, I'm like, I went to back to school night and my student's like desk is like 9 inches taller than the kid he's sitting to next. Like, it's like, yeah, like what is going on here? So those challenges, regardless of student population, those challenges are almost universal in Philadelphia schools. Again, that's not to say that because by when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. I come at this like I'm suing the state to fix it for all these schools. So I'm always kind of going back to the state level to say like this really is broken for everyone.
Yeah.
And it really is broken for everyone. Like even for the like the middle class kids who will do well at most schools they go to because they're coming with all these advantages. Like they're from their parents who are able to help them with their homework. You know, they're not working an overnight shift. They're just, if something is wrong, like their parents have the resources and the social capital to give them the thing. But even for those kids who will still eventually come out of high school doing fine because again, they've every resource. Those kids, a lot of those kids still do not have the resources that they deserve in their school. Like every kid deserves to have art and science and not have to have a principal who has to choose between art or science, which is what happens in a lot of schools. Like they deserve to go to schools that are not overheated, and a lot of those kids still go to schools without air conditioning. So even sort of from my like stepping back to like, because I'm just always focused on the ways the state has failed us, like even those kids like don't have what they deserve, and it is awful, and the kids of course that need the most get the least. And
is it okay, buddy?
Yeah.
I just have a question in regards to that. Like, so you mentioned earlier, you see capital projects as like over here.
Yeah.
And then funding itself is over here. And like a lot of this project is based around how old these schools are, and it takes capital projects to build new schools.
Yeah.
So like from your perspective, like I agree with Colombo. It's crazy that a school like Colombo, like their building is collapsing like around them.
Yeah.
And those students are dealing with that every day. And like we're not even getting to like the trauma related to that. Like, but like how do you see any of this changing in terms of capital projects? Like the school district building 2 new schools right now. They built one, I think, last year or the year before. Like, how do we replace the 70 schools that need to be replaced in Philadelphia without a massive investment, without like the state or the federal government, like it was in progressive era, coming in and saying, let's build these schools? Like, how do we get these schools? Because none of these buildings should still be functioning as schools.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, someone's got to pay for it. And so for people that don't know, the last time that Philadelphia studied this, and they were about to, maybe they did come out with it again. Last time they studied this, they said that their buildings needed about $4.5 billion to all get up to code citywide. And that's like 200 schools and 50 or some other buildings like sheds and stadiums and things like that. So the way that Pennsylvania funds, the only reason it doesn't have to be separate, but the way that Pennsylvania funds public education is they have sort of a student-based allocation. It's largely not student-based, but in theory, it's student-based allocation to each school district based on population size and things like that. Now, at least part of it's based on the needs of your school district, the level of poverty in your district. There's a million ways it's messed up, but it's for what they call basic education. And then they have a special education funding stream as well, and they fund other things like transportation. The way that the state has traditionally funded capital repairs, or not capital repairs, capital needs, is that they basically don't fund, sort of changing, but they traditionally don't fund repairs. So for an older district that already has things built, you're largely ineligible for the single biggest source of state capital because they really were only funding the building of new schools. The other thing is it's not an upfront funding, it's a reimbursement where because schools aren't really funded for it in Pennsylvania, the way that schools fund new buildings is they float debt, but they float bonds. They go to the capital market and go to Wall Street and get a bond, take out bonds, and they get a small portion of it reimbursed from the state, but it's a really small portion, like a tiny fraction. And so that's really awful because if you think about like if I offered to you like I'm going to reimburse 10% of your funding for your new school, Well, if you don't have the money to begin with to build the school, a 10% reimbursement is like a 0% reimbursement. I don't have the money to do that. So both the things that were eligible were really biased against older cities, like the Philadelphia, Johnstown, like pick your older places. You couldn't really build with you couldn't repair your schools largely with state funding. And also there wasn't upfront funding. So what really needs to happen is there needs to be a facilities fund that actually just funds new buildings. I mean, that's what needs to happen is we need to give districts upfront money to build. And we don't do that at all. It's all this reimbursement based stuff where we tell districts to go to the capital market. And so, the Philadelphia School District budget, about 10% of it each year goes to fund debt payments for the buildings that they have, and they cannot afford to float more bonds. So someone is going to have to pay for that. The city could, it's a poor city with a lot of needs. The city could put more into capital funding, or the federal government, but in general, it's a state-dominated system of funding, like everywhere in the country. And if we want it, the state's going to have to fund it. Like they have to fund capital in a way that they don't right now, because it just, you see the impact of it, and it's not unique to Philadelphia. One of the other school districts I represent in the school funding case is the Wolfberry area school district, and in Wolfberry, they had three neighborhood high schools in Wilkes-Barre, for the city of Wilkes-Barre. And in one of the neighborhood high schools, there's old masonry buildings. They had to build they had to fence off the school to put like about 15 feet of distance between the wall, the exterior wall, and anyone who could walk up. And then they had to build protective metal sheds for kids to walk into the schools because parts of the masonry were falling off the school. And they eventually knocked them all down. Like they just opened a new high school, a single consolidated high school. But that's like the reality in a lot of older places in Pennsylvania. Like the state does not fund historically underfunds these districts, has a funding system that does not allow for the actual refurbishment of a lot of these buildings. And we just see the result.
And Dan and I were talking about this a little bit before, we started here, that like the district could, if it anticipated its needs, it could build some new stuff. It could say, hey, burgeoning neighborhood, we're going to build this new school and it'll be ready in 5 years before we shut down your building that's falling apart. Right. But they don't. And also, like, philosophically, we're just not invested in the idea of neighborhood schools. So instead, what they do is they're like, we'll do a planning process and we'll just randomly shut down the schools that are underutilized. And then it's your problem. And you can just like, you can just travel across town to get a different school, because that's what we do in Philadelphia instead of investing in our neighborhoods. So, when they have a problem with a school, they just shut it down and they're like, go somewhere else, as opposed to, having like, a capital projects kind of mindset where they're going to say, okay, they can't get money from nowhere, but they could say, okay, we have identified that the city or someone could say, we've identified these neighborhoods are growing by this much %. And so this many of their school buildings are failing. And so like, that's, we're building one new school. Really?
Yeah.
One.
There's a disconnect between, and just in general in Philadelphia, I think there's a disconnect between, this is particularly bad when we had the school reform commission, right? So the school district was run by a state agency or state oversight commission. But there's a disconnect between the needs of the city and the needs of the school district. Like they are siloed in some ways, and I think some ways it's gotten better, but a lot of ways it's still terrible. Where like you should look at things holistically. School planning is a big part of that. Like, what are the needs of these neighborhoods for other uses? Is there a way to reuse these buildings, an underutilized building that still has life left in it, to use the top floor for some neighborhood uses and use the bottom floors? And they have challenges, but like use the bottom floors for schools. But there is you need to come up with the money somehow. So when West Philadelphia High School was built, I don't know, they think like the city's entire capital budget, the district's, I don't say entire, but huge proportion of the district's capital budget that year just went to West Philadelphia High School, but there are 200 school buildings. And so it's just a huge problem when we're in this sort of deprivation mindset. And I think a lot of the mistakes, and the district certainly makes mistakes, but a lot of institutional mistakes the school district makes it's just you are living in an era of not enough. It's just always not enough. And so it's just like it's always about sacrificing one thing for another. We have to make these decisions about like, do we build a new school, or do we fix more roofs on schools, or do we do more asbestos work or things like that? And they're terrible choices. It's just when you have $4 billion worth of need, not all that $4 billion is urgent, but a lot of it is. Like a lot of it, if we actually ask parents, like, hey, what do you think about the lead paint remediation that you have? And you're like, you say that's urgent. Or lack of air conditioning in an era of global warming. So there are a ton of needs, a ton of profound needs. And so I always come off as a defender of the school district. And I don't mean to be, the school district does a lot of things wrong, but I do think that a lot of these terrible choices are because they are given these terrible choices to make that are all like, it's a reality that the state, whomever has created. We have created, in other states, in capital spending, for example, I think Dr. Haidt said this, but there's one, I think in Georgia, for example, they fund capital repairs separately, but out of a sales tax, statewide sales tax, and it just funds a capital program. So all the schools are doing because they just have this, we make these choices. These are all choices we make. The conditions of these schools didn't just get like that. There was this series of particular policy choices from the 1970s to today about how we fund our public schools. And that's why they look like that.
And what's interesting for me from that is like, you have like the way that they've structured funding for so long, and it starts at the federal level. Like, it starts with the fact that when these schools were built, the ones in this project, like there was this massive federal funding investment. There was this massive, and what you mentioned about like using someone for neighborhood uses, that was part of it. The guy, there was like money for that. And again, it's like all of that money, us just one day deciding that like everything has to be profitable. There was like there used to be this vision that like not everything that the government spends money on has to be profitable. There was this idea that like buses don't need to be profitable. Why should they have to be profitable? They're a service. They render a service to that people need. And the same thing goes to school districts. It's a service. It shouldn't be profitable. But one day the federal government decided that like, well, we can't run a certain amount of deficit. We can't spend a certain amount of money, and we need to try and like balance the budget and give tax breaks to whoever and whatnot. And like when all of that stuff happens, it trickles down to the state, and the state has to decide what they're going to spend money on. The state has to decide who they're going to tax, and that's all affected by who's going to reelect them. And when that trickles down to the city level, like there is no money. And that thing is like, I don't think you come off as a defender of the school district because you didn't make bad decisions almost every single day, definitely. And the coolest thing about being in the union is I can say that about my employer. But like they make terrible decisions every day. But you're right, they are decisions that are affected by this impossible situation. And I'm the same way about SEPTA. Like I come off as a big SEPTA defender because SEPTA runs terribly. It's awful. It's an awful thing. But again, they're put in a situation by not getting comparable stuff funding from the state like other transportation systems in other cities do. And the same thing with like Philadelphia, like Pennsylvania ranks 44th in how much the state contributes to our public education in the city. Pennsylvania contributes almost nothing compared to the states next to it. So it's something to think about that like they could be contributing more, but contributing more to Philadelphia as a school district isn't going to get them reelected on the main line. And that's all it has to do with is for me, it's a lot of that stuff.
I think that was what was interesting to me when I was reading about the case that you worked on, Dan, was I read some quotes from the lawyers on the other side of the aisle that were talking about like their argument was they were already providing basic education and safe buildings. And it's just like reading that while being in Philadelphia, like
they say
that.
something like they have walls and a roof.
Yeah.
Or like they put a place. Philadelphia was like, yeah,
Columbus down the street.
but no roof.
Yeah.
But I think that's like one of, like, it's. A lot of what's going on is hypocritical, right? And that's like what Mike just said, is from like the federal line down to the state line, down to the local line of like. Every politician sucks, but like, but part of that too is like, what are the actual assessments involved? And like, if like what you just said, Dan, of like, there are over 200 schools that aren't passing inspection right now, and how can you on the state level argue in a case being like, everything's safe, what do you mean, we're providing basic needs? And I'm just like, how, like, you know, there's like a differentiation between like what is law and legal and can be argued in court versus like what lived reality is. And I'm like interested to hear your perspective about that.
Sure. So in terms of what is legal, we don't know yet. We'll find out sometime in the next few months, probably. In the funding lawsuit, we sent a photographer around to a bunch of our districts who have these, facilities that are often falling apart. And the photographer went around in between, I think, November of 2019 and February of 2020, and then in case like everything got sort of scrambled a little bit because of COVID. So, by the time you take pictures of things that are, a panel that's coming down or paint that's falling or whatever you want to do, and 2 years later, is it like this, like that? No, it doesn't. So one of the big fights in the case was, well, that condition doesn't still exist, does it? Well, no, of course not, because in general, if you see peeling paint, you're going to eventually, if there's leaks, you're going to plug the leak eventually, right? But why are there so many leaks here? Well, because we can't afford to fix the roof. So that was sort of a general fight we had, which was like, well, how current is all of this? But we're hoping that the court will find like this is evidence of sort of a systemic problem. I mean, a lot of this comes down to, so there has never, well, there's been only one other trial in Pennsylvania history that's delved into these issues, which is what does the actual Pennsylvania Constitution require? So the Pennsylvania Constitution, like every other state constitution, has an education clause in it, unlike the federal Constitution. And so what rights does it actually give to kids is what this is about. I mean, practically speaking, I don't think that most state legislators would tour a school district in Philadelphia or Wilkes-Barre or Johnstown and say that their kid should be in that school in those conditions. Even if a lot of good stuff is happening in these schools, again, like my son has had had an amazing teacher last year, is an amazing teacher this year. Has all the gifts in the world, but like he still goes to school in a condition that no one would actually choose for their, like, would say, yes, that's what makes sense. It makes sense for that. Yeah, sure. And so, there's arguments about what the Constitution requires. Does it require, a wall, are there desks? Well, there are desks, but, are they like this different in height? Are they falling apart? Are there walls? Well, yes, there are walls, but they're cracking. Are there ceilings? I mean, there are ceilings, and they do repair the leaks that come down, which we have leaks constantly in these buildings, So there's a lot of that. There was a lot of that at trial. I think it's pretty basic. Like we believe that every kid should have safe, modern facilities. And that includes like facilities to play sports. Like I think that one of the things that happened in the trial was the idea that so one story that the state told was in Johnstown they replaced their lights on their football stadium. That was like, that showed that look, they've got plenty of money. You say they need these reading specialists, but they just spent $70,000, whatever the money was, that coming for replacing their football stadium lights. Well, every school district plays sports on Friday, like plays football on Friday night. So unless you think that these kids are not deserving of getting to play extracurricular activities, like every other kid, then you actually have to replace the lights because no one will play with them if they're going to play with them. And so, again, I'm rambling here, but like what the law actually requires is an open, it's open for debate. I don't think that it requires like the Taj Mahal, but I certainly think that it requires safe, modern facilities that can heat it when it's cold, that can cool it down when it's hot, that have enough electrical outlets that don't blow when you have to plug in all of your computers, that have, space for modern learning needs and things like that. But we'll see what the election is.
And talking about how other states, they contribute more than Pennsylvania. I'm originally from upstate New York. I went to a poor, crappy elementary school, and then for high school, I went in a college town. It was a little better, but still not great. And my kids, having been brought up in the Philadelphia school district, it does sound like the Taj Mahal to them. I'm like, the same 2 teachers taught 5th grade for 20 years. Like if there were 2 fewer 5th graders one year, they didn't get fired and sent to another school. They just waited until the next year to see if there were more 5th graders. And I always had an art, a music, and a technology teacher. If I wanted to play an instrument, there was a room with instruments in it, and I picked one. If I wanted to do an after-school sport or activity, there was not an extra charge. We didn't have to form a community partnership for it. It just happened. And my kids are like, wow, that sounds crazy. And did the ceiling fall down? And I'm like, no, a ceiling never fell down on me when I was in school.
Yeah.
And to me, like, that's the minimum, right? That there are enough teachers and books and pencils. And then the extra stuff is truly extra. And we don't, I mean, like Dan said, I mean, like, people from Lower Merion wouldn't put up with this.
So I think everything is like reverse logic, right? Like I grew up post 9/11, like I was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened. So all of the like school stuff under Bush and like PSSAs came in as I was like going through high school and middle school. And like the logic there, right, is like, if your school isn't testing well, we're gonna send state people in to fix your school. And if that doesn't work, we'll just shut it down and take it over. And like, logic would tell you, if people are testing badly, we should invest more into that school to make sure that their test scores go up, rather than, no, you don't have school anymore,
Even Dr. Hite, who came into Philadelphia and the end of these just draconian cuts. I mean, he came in at the lowest of the low as they were closing schools and just doing awful things. And he at some point reflected upon the fact that mode of like churn as a good, like destabilize as a good, was just wrong. It's like clearly it failed, and the idea that like, that we went through this like shutdown, so that we shut down these bad schools, like as if a school is not just a representation of what you're putting into it. Like, it's not haunted. It's not like you need to knock down a haunted building. Like it's a public institution, and if the public institution is messed up, you figure out why it's messed up and you fix it, as opposed to shutting it down and in the lowest of the low of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia school privatization, like handing the keys over to a nonprofit or whomever to run the school. Like, you're gonna run the school. We are like, there are places in Philadelphia that don't have, they literally, their neighborhood public school is a charter school. And again, there are some good charter schools in Philadelphia, but the very concept of the fact that like you are literally having a public enterprise, a public institution essentially cede their place in certain neighborhoods, it was crazy. And it was the idea is we're gonna shut these down, we're gonna hand them up, it'll have to be better. And of course, the reality, and again, as Dr. Hite himself later would admit, like, it failed. That's just clearly not how it works. And why would it?
The reverse logic of, let's actually just hand all this public money and this building full of students, let's just hand it to a bunch of real estate developers who decided to draft like a constitution for a school.
Well, I think that's like, that goes into like the larger issues of just like everything that's happening in Philly right now in terms of gentrification and like overtaking neighborhoods.
But even if you meant well, even if you truly you were a charter school operation that meant well, and that truly the people there, like, there are obviously like a lot of teachers at charter schools are really still really dedicated educators, and a lot of administrators are dedicated to. There's some other larger problems, but like, why do you think that that would be a better solution? Like, even if they're the most well-meaning, like what's the secret? That's the thing, like, there's no, and if there really was a secret, then how come the district isn't just doing what they're doing? But the reality is that, like, school improvement is long and slow, and it's boring. Like, it's just like, you need to have enough well-trained adults in front of kids. Like, that's all it really comes down to. And so there's no cheap way to get around it. That, like, you actually just have to pay for it. It's really expensive. Like, that's like public school, if they're done well in an era of really big student need, are going to be really expensive because kids have a lot of money. Like, that's it. And so, like, there's no reason that even the most well-meaning charter school student, like, and we've just seen it play out. They don't do anything. They just don't. And we shouldn't expect them to do any better, because, like, there's no secret here. If there was, we would have copied it already in the last 20 years.
I'm someone who, like, typically I will paint like a lot of the charter school people with that, like, they're these villainous money bags. But you're right, even if they are, and there are some really, like, community-based, well-meaning organizations where, like, we're gonna start a school and we're gonna fix this. But you're right, there's no way to guarantee they do well. And also, like, what does that say to the district to just admit defeat? In certain parts of the city, especially, they've admitted defeat to multiple student populations and said, like, you know what, we actually can't run schools in West Philly. We're not going to try them. We're just going to give it to them. In certain parts of North Philly, you know what, the kids too hard. We're just going to hand it off to somebody else. And the fact that, like, there are people at the highest level who are making six figures are willing to say, you know what, we're going to hand it off. Like, that right there encapsulates, like, so much of the problem. And you're right, there's no reason to think that they would do better, hand it off. But here we are, handing it off again.
Yeah, and the market is never, they're always like, the market will fix it. The market will never fix it, because it's, number one, it's a public good. And number two, the people with means are always going to figure out a way to manipulate it so that they get a slightly better deal.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be the people with no other options who are left behind. And so what you want to make is, like, the default option to be the good option. But again, that is going to require you to, open your checkbooks and, like, philosophically embrace the idea that yes, we build things, we fix things, we believe in these monolithic buildings as an anchor of our community.
Yeah. And like, we talk about the market, like, that implies marketing, which is what we see a lot of. And, like, and so one of the reasons it doesn't work is because, like, the school district itself spends very little money on, we talked about this, like, on communicating with parents, because, like, they're the public school, like, you just send your kids there. That's what, right? But the reality is that there's a lot of marketing that goes into parents. I mean, if you think about we have, a whole other class of charter schools, called cyber charter schools, right? And they're, by any metric, performing just so poorly, and take in a lot of money, given that they don't actually have any schools, and there's all sorts of crazy things for the way we fund cyber charter schools. But they spend a ton of money on marketing. And so if you're a busy parent and the neighborhood school, as things are falling down, and, the marketing to these kids, the marketing to these parents is, like, a lot of money goes in telling these kids that this is a good option. And, it's just one more failure of the market. It's not a good option. It's like, for almost every kid, those schools are they're not great, but, like, and they are getting a lot of money for what they're actually doing, recorded classes and things like that.
It makes me so crazy when I see a bus wrap for a charter school, or, like, multiple billboards that my tax dollars paid for, and then I got to go out and raise money for my kids to have paper. I'm so infuriated that, like, they get to spend my money on all of this marketing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, please give me one of those cyber charters marketing budget. They had a float in the parade.
Yeah, the most insidious part
Like,
of that.
please
is,
give me one school marketing budget for school supplies for a year and let me see what I can do with it.
Most of the city's part of that is like what the cyber schools is then is, that the advertising dollars go to very connected Harrisburg-based firms. So the public dollars go to the, get wasted because, just to give you an example of how illogical this is. If you send a kid from Philadelphia to cyber school A, cyber school, let's say they get $12,000, whatever it is. If you send a kid from Lower Merion, moves across the line, and they still go to the cyber school, that kid pays $24,000 to cyber school A, right? The services are the exact same, but it doesn't matter. The cyber school just gets whatever the district gives them. Like there's no connection to what they're actually doing for the kids. So they then spend all of this money on advertising and lobbying and things like that. And you just have to follow the money as to who gets the advertising contract. It is an awful cycle funded off of sort of public dollars and disinvestment. It's
And that's when I get to do the thing where the money back's coming. They are actually literally villains in that way. Right? Like sometimes I think people are villains that aren't villains. They are literally the villains in public education system on like kind of a cartoony level.
I do want to open up for questions for the audience if you're like, almost at time,
We could do that
but
forever.
yeah. But also, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is like the accountability of the money, like who is making these decisions and like how could, I mean, I know the answer, but like in terms of like city hall, how much control is happening of the school district, or is the school district essentially just getting this money handed from the state and the city and operating of their own accord? And like, what say do we as tax-paying citizens have in this conversation? And then I'll give you guys space.
you start there as the person who.
I'd love to have a mayor that cared about public schools. That's where I'm gonna start. Like theoretically, the superintendent reports to the board and the board reports to the mayor. And the truth is that nobody actually cares about that reporting relationship. The board is, like you said, the thing about the defender of the district. Look, I'm the last person to defend the school board. They're not paid. It's a state law that they can't be paid. They are doing a ton of work for nothing.
And they can't raise taxes.
And they can't raise taxes, right? So they only have whatever budget they're given to make decisions with it. And yes, they make some terrible decisions, but like they are volunteers given nothing to work with. But they could vote no sometimes. They could, or they could say, that decision sucks. Why don't you go back to the drawing board with that? And they don't. But they are very limited in their power. Like they could do something, but not much. And the mayor doesn't really care. City council doesn't really care. The education committee of city council held 2 hearings last year, I think. And one of them was about the magnet school lottery because they were mad about that. So like, think about it, like what we have all just been through with the pandemic, they held one education committee to talk about actual education committeeing, so everybody is just asleep at the wheel and they don't care about it because they'll just send their kids to private school or they'll get them into like one of the, they'll get them into master or something basically.
I mean, you see around the country like that, there's different levels, there's different modes of school governance where you have strong mayor systems where essentially the mayor picks the school board. The theory behind that is like, well, there's one person that can be accountable. That that was the way that New York was, maybe still is. Other places, it was pushed often by people that wanted to quickly privatize systems. At least in that era, I don't think that's necessarily indicative of the governance decision itself, but of the governance mode itself, but that's just I think a recent historical fact. And so I think there's been some pushback for people saying we should have, you have a locally elected school board. And there's a lot of positives, I think, for Philadelphia electing a local school board. I think there's also some real risks. But either way, what you want is a system where there's actually people accountable, and particularly especially bad when you have the school reform commission where you have 5 people appointed, 2 or 3 by someone in Harrisburg, only 2 by someone in Philadelphia. And it was all about diffusion of responsibility. There was just no way to hold anyone accountable. At least right now for our system in Philadelphia, people should hold the mayor responsible for what's happening in schools. I mean, he appoints the school board members. They are accountable to him more than anything else. Like, we have to hold the mayor responsible. Like, and you can have whatever system you want, but for the system that we have, you have to hold the mayor responsible because I mean, there can be some like policy choices that the school district makes, and some some more sort of waste or whatever, or disagreement in philosophy. But for the real problems, you have to hold City Hall responsible because City Hall picks who those are, and obviously also the Harrisburg and the governor and stuff like that. But for your sort of parent advocacy about the way that the school board is making its decision, the mayor appoints the school board, and so the mayor has to take responsibility for the way they are or are not performing. And I think one of the real insidious things in the last 25 years in Philadelphia is sort of purposeful diffusement of accountability and responsibility for the way our schools were being run.
And at the end of the day, they end up blaming the families and the teachers and the students. They put so much of that blame and that lack of accountability, they put it on the communities and they put it on the students, and they say, and they really characterize the student populations often as bad, quote unquote, at neighborhood schools. Neighborhood schools are not good. And they don't, it's not publicly, but that's where a lot of the
publicly.
Yeah, publicly sometimes. That's where a lot of the sentiment goes, and it's insane that you would take like the person responsible, the people that are appointed by the person responsible, and let them just consistently act as if the only ones responsible are the students. That they're literally victims of this system, and they're just blaming these victims. And sometimes they move on to the teachers, and I can take that. They want to say it's my fault, that's fine, but not my students. It's not their fault. They're born in the zip code that they're born in. They deserve a public education that's good and just, and put them in a position where they can live a healthy and fruitful life.
So since we're going into an election year for a new mayor, what is is a factor that plays into all of our lives, regardless of if we have kids or not? What is like the right question to be asking people who are running?
I mean, I would just say, like, a very general, what is your plan for public schools? Not do you support public schools? Because I have heard I like Alan Dom that comes out and is like, I support public schools. And I'm like, what? Have you ever even set foot in a public school? So don't ask people, do you support public schools? Say, what is your plan for the school district of Philadelphia? And just keep coming back to it. If it's some mealy mouth, oh, I support public schools. Okay, how are you going to invest in neighborhood schools? What are you going to do about the facilities crisis? What are you going to do about the enrollment patterns that are, driving enrollment down? Because there are plenty of kids in the city of Philadelphia. What is your, what's your plan for the board? Are you going to transition to an elected board, or are you going to start actually, pulling some people off of the board if they're not doing their jobs? Or are you going to encourage them? Are you, the mayor of Philadelphia could wake up tomorrow and he could say, we are not going to level school teachers in the school district of Philadelphia anymore. Superintendent Watlington, figure it out. I am not going to be the mayor of a city that pulls teachers out of a classroom mid-year. That's not the kind of town I want to be the mayor of. He could say that, and Wallington could be like, oh, there's no money, could you give me, could you find $12 million in your couch cushion? But he could say that, but he's not going to say that because he doesn't care. And that's what I want to see. I want to see people who care and actually have a plan to do something.
I think the thing for me is that Democrats have had control of Philadelphia for so long that there's no incentive for them to do better. And they might always win, but at least we could put some pressure on them by supporting Working Families Party and people like that who are at least trying to push the Democrats in Philadelphia in the right direction. Because at the moment, Democratic candidates in Mayor in Philadelphia have a certain number of issues they can cave to the Northeast Philadelphia vote on, the Penn Sport vote on. They have a certain amount of issues where if they cave a little bit, they can assure themselves a victory and support from the parts of Philadelphia that don't really want to be parts of Philadelphia. So if they are willing to cave on education from one of those parent groups that is, not on the left and not willing to support progressive education policies and stuff like that, they'll cave if that can get them extra votes and stuff like that. And that's just because they're almost assured to win, you know? So it's like, if we can start supporting like Working Families Party and other people, again, is it realistic that one of those people would win for mayor? No, but not the moment. But at least trying to apply some sort of pressure and say, like, we're not gonna settle for this Democratic candidate because they're a Democratic candidate. We're not gonna let you do this to us just because you've been assured a victory because this population of the city is a certain percent, whatever race or whatever, you know? Because that's what Democrats have been doing, they've been posting on that for, I don't even know how many years in Philadelphia. And we're letting them post on that, and then they appoint a school board that sucks. And then the school board doesn't make the right decisions, and the mayor refuses to put pressure on the superintendent. And it's like, if we let them keep posting on that, then it leads the students, and when they're obsessively putting everything on schools and making schools like the be all end all of society and saying like schools are responsible for all the issues in society the way that they do, and trying to make schools responsible for fixing society, you can't do that if you're going to post to some terrible answer about schools if you're the mayor. You don't get to put that pressure on schools if you're not trying to fix it and they're not trying to fix it.
My wife is selling gifts to the staff, so I'll just.
Well, then
I have no opinion.
Does anyone have any questions?
Sure. So you, the conversation about the within Philadelphia inequality is really interesting to me, and as it relates to the state funding law, legal challenge. If that is successful, how do you think that's going to shape the dynamic in Philadelphia? If at all?
Well, so the thing to know about a school funding lawsuit is there's just a numerous number of outcomes. You know, because it's you win on paper, but when you're talking billions of dollars, like a judge can't go to the state and say, okay, give them $4 billion more, and like, oh, the state just does it.
The Brinks truck.
Yeah. There's not $billions sitting there to be generated, and so there's often a push and pull. I mean, I would just say just generally, if we make serious, deep investments in our public schools, all it really does is it creates the conditions to be successful. But it's really just that, you know, it's not. It's going to be incumbent upon Philadelphia and every other district to spend it right. And it's not going to get into like the nitty-gritty governance of it all. I mean, my hope is that, I mean, so we talked a little bit about the you know, Dr. Hyde and the principals, right? That Dr. Hyde would come up or send someone up to Stephanie and say, your principal could select to do X. Like what happens in Philadelphia is each year a principal gets a sheet and says, you know, for this number of students, here's your allocation. Your allocation, you get, you know, one counselor, you get $20 per student for this level of supplies. It's a crazy thing. And so, you know, you can purchase a library, right? But no one purchased, so we don't have any librarians. We got Dr. Height, we'll could select librarians. Well, they can't because they need another special education need for putting them on all these awful choices. What I would hope is that we would begin to remove those choices. Like it's never going to be perfect. But for the most part, what I hope is that we create a system where you have a student who presents with a need and you're able to meet that need. End story. I mean, how insane is it that we have schools that have kids that go in? I mean, in Philadelphia, I think it's something like 2/3 of kids come into school not able to identify more than 2/3 of the alphabet. Those kids need help. They need help. And we do not have the resources to help those kids. It's insane. So what an idealized system would begin to give people the resources to make those choices. I mean, I don't know if people know who Ori Monson is. He's the CFO of School District of Philadelphia. He's a very dry guy. He was sobbing on the stand. You know, this is awful. We put people in awful choices at every level, and it felt, you know, from the top to the classroom. And so what an idealized version is just removing those barriers, but it's still going to be up to, even if we had utopia, it would still be up to the School District of Philadelphia to spend it right and to make those choices in the right way.
And I also think, I mean, there are, you know, there's variation within the School District of Philadelphia, right? You know, if every school in Philadelphia got X number of dollars more per student, there's still going to be the schools that are able to fundraise more and have investment from their friendly local university who wants a PR stunt. You know, like there's still, like, yes, the bottom will come up a little bit, right? But, you know, there still is going to be, like, there's still going to be inequality between schools. We're going to have to figure out, you know, how to make sure that everybody has enough and how, you know, we level that out.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, we should
It's
have.
not, yeah, they're not going to give us enough money for every school to have a librarian.
Well,
They're
yeah,
not.
I mean, if that is that's ridiculous, but that may be true. I mean, and that's the only thing, ideally in Philadelphia, here, ideally we would end the school-based budgeting process, which is this crazy, insane thing that started 30 years ago, where principals said, hey, what would you like to purchase? Like these are educational resources that every kid needs. The idea that we make principals buy a librarian or buy an expert counselor or buy, you know, choose between, you get like your budget for small schools, you get to choose effectively between art and music. That's just utterly insane. And again, I think it probably started as a way to diffuse responsibility at the superintendent level to the principal. Like you choose what to do.
It's quite surreal when you really put
It's insane.
It really
It's
is.
insane. You can literally, you know, just look at the Philadelphia publishers every year. You will see like the number of dollars in school supplies and art supplies that you get per student. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's like everyone knows it doesn't work. So yeah, ending that, burning that book.
I'm kind of curious about the donations that you're talking about, like, how does it work? And like, how is it legal that, somebody can take the donation to a specific public school and not to, you know, just a fund for all public schools?
Okay, so first of all, I would never want the school district to have the money. Like the money that people do give to my school, wow, I do not want it to go through the district office because they'll come and use it for something else. But how it works is that a lot of schools have like a friends group or some kind of booster club, or their home and school association or PTA has a separate 501c3 so that they can collect money. And what happens is that, you know, schools, they do fundraising, they raise a bunch of money, they're able to buy extra, you know, some of them raise enough money to buy an extra counselor or buy an extra kindergarten teacher or things like this. And they also use this as like a recruitment method, right? So, I mean, like what happens in my neighborhood is that other schools that had more white kids held big old fundraisers and recruited all the white parents to their schools. And now they have like a $40,000 annual fund that parents donate for them. You know, so it's just this like reoccurring cycle that, you know, parents are looking at two schools and one is good at fundraising and they're like, hey, we're building a library now. And the parent is like, I want to send my kid to the school with a library. And so, you know, they send their kid there and they start making their donations there. And that's, you know, and so that gap widens. And I'm guilty of it too, right? Like my school has paper now. My kid, you know, like we have a friends group and there's only like 6 of us, but we do some fundraising and now we're a little bit ahead of others, you know, other schools, and we have enough paper and we get to have a scholastic book fair and, you know, some other schools don't. But we shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And it's not, any, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you know, like they have bake sales in the suburbs too.
yeah.
But again, it's like the school district takes everything away. You know what I mean? They're like, you get $20 in school supplies per kid per year. Everybody knows that's not enough. Right? So like either I make up that difference or I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is more the what do you have a bake sale for? It's like, it's not crazy. There's always going to be a thing that a student group wants to do they're going to raise money for. Like we probably all did it in our growing up, right? The problem is you have parents fundraising for paper. I mean, like that, you know, it's like, what's your baseline? You start with like your baseline. It's like we have, like again, in the worst of the worst time, in like 2013, you know, you had groups of parents, everybody else desperate to have their school stop suffering, but it's like the parent that could make it less bad would make it less bad for them. Yeah, well, I think I just did that. All right. Sorry, so parents made it less bad for their own kids, but the cause of that is like the baseline is, the baseline is so terrible. That's the problem. You know, it's like, I don't think you're ever gonna get out of, again, there's a reason why the bumper sticker about like, no school should have to have a bake sale, we should have to have a bake sale for bombers, whatever that
Right.
the teachers always had on their cars. Like, schools everywhere have bake sales, you know, but they have bake sales in Philadelphia that have paper. Like that I think is.
And there was a point, like my kids in 7th grade, so I've been doing this for 7 years, right? So in the beginning, the pallet of paper would come and it would be like Christmas. The teachers would come and I would be like, here's your case of paper. And they were like, woo. And there was a point where the principal said to me, like one year I was away, I was visiting faculty somewhere else for a year. And the principal was like, I'm just gonna keep the paper now. And the teachers are okay with that because now they know there's gonna be enough. They know every year you're gonna come with the paper and there's gonna be enough and they don't have to hoard their little ream and walk it to the copier to make a copy and then take it back to their classroom, right? They know they can just chill out and walk up to the copier. And that is such a metaphor for the entire school district of Philadelphia, right? Like there's never enough. And so everybody is just clinging to their little ream of paper, hoping that it will last them through the year.
And telling kids to not throw erasers at each other.
Right.
Gary.
Yeah. Greenfield, which is the Center City Elementary, Center City residents are the ones who give them the money. Look at that, it's demographic and class. Simple. Where I live, in African community, West Philly. Cassidy, we had 3 daughters went to Cassidy. They just tore it down. So the local little kids who go to elementary get bucked. As of last week, we had a granddaughter, it takes her 2 hours to get back to the house. You get to New York for that. I spent 40 years at community college in Philadelphia. I was co-chair of local 2020. I ended up in institutional veteran communications, Beverly Lobby. In the 90s, I was on some committee with Dwight Evans, and it might have been the last time the Democrats controlled Harrisburg. They had a bill to change the funding model in Pennsylvania. And I've been trying to remember what year it is, and they lost, Republicans have controlled it ever since. And the problem to me, one of the real problems, when you use the analogy of $24 to $4 million, as opposed to $10 for Philadelphia, that's the property tax. As long as you're going to use property tax in Pennsylvania, you're not going to have an equitable school. Why should a kid who has live in a less fluent neighborhood have less money per student? I've been doing a project with somebody from Temple in Pennsylvania. I've been in Reading and Brownsville and Bonner County, which is just amazing. It makes Philadelphia look good in some ways, some of these places. And I know you talk Wilkes-Barre. We had a school up there in 2019. We're going to take the kids away from the parents because they didn't pay for the lunch bill during 1 year. And it was right outside of Wilkes-Barre on the way. So the solution is we had to negotiate with the state. It was a formula for community colleges, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Never did it. The other problem is in Philadelphia in the 60s, when the union started, the Philadelphia sports teams were paid as much as the suburban teams or more, which is no longer the case. There are so many economic and political factors driving this. But the single line avenue as the barrier for equal education, I think is obscene.
Speaker, what was your question? Yeah, you're not gonna get any disagreement from up here.
I apologize.
Right? Yeah.
In whatever we talked about, this is a constant topic in the people. My boss was a deputy mayor in the Wendell, but she did all the lobbying for the school. We had newspaper people doing the PR work, and this came out constantly. But it was like hitting your head against the wall. And to confirm what you said about Masterman, whatever Masterman does, bro, community college lets them use the library, the gym, private learning center we need too, because they're local. They're building, I had 3 daughters, and one went to Central, Bodine, and Stare. And Bodine looked like a Catholic school, like junior high. When they played basketball, they had to move it was a lunchroom, for God's sake. They moved the table.
I just worry about I always think about the property tax thing and just think like it feels so hopeless because there's no way to ever convince an entire state of people who hate Philadelphia. Like you gotta remember, like in Pennsylvania, you have like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and then you have an entire, and again, like that takes away like Wolfberry and stuff like that, but so much of the state have this contempt for Philadelphia and politics in Philadelphia, and even people in Philadelphia, why they don't fund stuff that do. Like, how do we convince them that our kids don't deserve this?
But we can't even convince our own city, because we like give a tax, we give the abatement.
Yeah, we haven't even
Yeah.
mentioned.
Right, we're like, buy a new house in
How do we get
Philadelphia.
through something that mentions the abatement?
But you don't actually have to contribute anything to your, to the school district tax base.
Come move here, have a kid, you won't have to pay for the
Right.
first 9 years of their
Don't pay
education.
for anything, and, and then you're just gonna move to the suburbs if you're not happy with the situation.
I know it's, I just I know we're finishing up, but just to say to that last thing is, so there are a lot of places in Pennsylvania with underfunded schools, and public schools consistently in polls, people are willing to pay for public schools. Like because like the grandparents who know their grandkids are going to go to school, people want to be able to send their kids to their schools. So I think that we have a system right now where there's the Republican Party is fairly controlled by anti-tax people that has taken over that party. But even in traditionally Republican areas, the people who are registered Republican, like there is real support for public schools out there in Pennsylvania, and so there is a path forward, I think, statewide. It's not about Philadelphia. But from Wolfberry to Johnstown and everywhere in between, that people want well-funded, highly functioning, safe, modern public schools.
I think that's a good place to end it. We all agree. So thank you, all 3 of you, for coming. This is great. Yeah.
Come see my chart.
Yeah. For people at home, if you haven't already seen Mike's show, it's up through the 12th of October. So please come see it. We're open 11 to 5 Wednesdays through Sundays. Everyone who's here, please look at the art.
If you're not local, there's a digital walkthrough that's
Yeah,
and an online print tour.
yeah. Please, they're all for sale. And there is a whole edition for each print. Collect them all.
Support the Philadelphia Public School teachers.
Okay, thank you.